позову... Доброе утро. И позову...
Good morning. I would like to ask all my colleagues who are going to participate in discussion to come over here. Please take your seats here. Our moderator, Mikhail Zygar, that I substituted for a time being. Sorry about that, but I began his work. Thank you, Vladimir. I wanted to make sure everybody is comfortable here. I took care of all the guests. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you all for coming. It's really nice to see you here at such an early hour. It's great to see so many happy faces in this audience, because I can see that everybody is about to have a talk about happiness. And I guess most of the speakers already got used to talking about happiness, but I have to say that this subject of happiness has become extremely relevant in the recent years, and it is now very popular at the economic forums. I know that throughout many centuries this subject was more for discussion at home rather than at the level of state, because politics, diseases, wars were the main subjects of concern for the state, and these were the things that our discussions focused upon. But since the technological development went up so fast, we really saw a leap in terms of economic development. So we now realize that it's not only the survival that we should care about. The economic development and the financial well-being are not the only subjects that we should talk about, that are the crucial things for humanity, because there are also non-economic factors that directly affect the internal state of happiness of people. So beginning with 2011, the UN began to focus on the general well-being and the happiness of all. So we were going to talk today about different criteria and the measurements, whether the index of happiness could be measured at all, and whether we can deal with this on the federal level, whether we can really develop happiness and imbue happiness into people's mind, and whether individual and social happiness and public happiness are related to each other. Can we force somebody to be happy? Or maybe we should first take certain steps so that the whole society could feel happier. We have been extremely happy today because we are having the biggest experts on happiness in the world, and I hope that they're the happiest people of the planet. And I would like to introduce Mike Peterson, who is the author of the bestseller Hygge, the happiness of Denmark, or Danish happiness. Let me take my paper. I'm sorry if I mixed up such something. So Mike Wiking is CEO of the Institute of Happiness Research from Denmark, and he is a member of a consultation group that prepares the report about global policies of happiness. So he deals not only with Danish happiness, but also trying to develop a recipe for the happiness and how we can borrow the experience from Denmark. So my first question would probably seem easy, and I guess it's not the first time that you hear this. Most Scandinavian countries are considered to be the happiest countries in the world. Is this the result of some state policy maybe it's outside of political sphere and the reason lies outside of policies. Maybe it's not something that comes from the top. Maybe it's about ethics and morals or relationship between people.
I think it's all of those. I think it is about relationship between people. I think it is a result of policies. I think it's a result of morals. But I think it's useful to look across the spectrum at countries and why some countries are doing better than others. So what we often work with is the World Happiness Report, which have a ranking of 155 countries in that. Currently, Finland is the happiest country in the world. Russia is at place 68, I believe. And in the lowest end of the scale, we have countries like Syria and Afghanistan and the Central African Republic. But if you look across the entire spectrum of countries, you can see there are actually 6 factors that explain 75% of the variance between happiness levels in those countries. So first we have GDP levels. We can see richer countries are on average happier. There's a lot of complexity in that, and I'll get back to that in a second. We can also see healthy life expectancy is another factor. Freedom to make life decisions. So are people feeling in control over their lives? Fourthly, we can see freedom from corruption. So if people are paying their taxes, but those money are going into the wrong pockets and not back to people in terms of quality of life, obviously that is something that undermines happiness in a country. Fifthly, we see the level of generosity in society. And then, Michael, as you talked about earlier, relationships, so social support. So I think it's encouraging that we see more and more countries being interested in well-being measures and recognizing that the way we've been measuring progress is insufficient when we look at GDP levels. And I think there is a growing global sentiment that in a lot of countries people feel that we've gotten richer without necessarily getting happier. And that's why we see more governments lately, for instance, New Zealand, incorporating well-being in political decisions and the way they measure progress. So recently New Zealand introduced a well-being budget, and now proposals for the budget has to come attached with an assessment on how this is going to improve quality of life. Just the last thing I want to say in this part was that the complexity around the relationship between money and happiness. There is a relationship, but that's mainly due to the fact that being without money is a cause of unhappiness. So for a lot of poorer countries, it makes sense to try and improve quality of life or improve GDP levels. But we also see as countries get richer, there is diminishing marginal returns from increasing GDP levels. And I think we also experience it in our own personal lives. The first money we get, we spend on housing, we spend on food. But if we're already making a fair amount of money, if we get additional income, we spend them on things that doesn't necessarily bring additional happiness. We can also see that people not only care about the absolute income, but they care about the relative income. So how much money do I make compared to everybody else? So there was just a brief overview of some of the factors and some of the complexities. But I am really encouraged to see globally, and of course Bhutan have taken a lead in this 40, 50 years ago, but now we see more and more governments looking at these measures. So this is a very good time to be not only a happiness researcher, but a citizen.
Спасибо, давайте. Спасибо, Майк. И еще один очень...
Thank you, Mike. And one more interesting exporter of happiness that we are having today is Jen Lin. She is the founder of the company Delivering Happiness. And you have many interesting business cases, and you took part in setting up the Ministry of Happiness in the United Arab Emirates. So tell us more about it. How did the country decide to set up the Ministry of Happiness, and whether it's possible to give a recipe, whether it's possible to export happiness from one country to another?
First of all, clicker. This is the other presentation for today. Yeah. So, thank you for having me here. First of all, it's a really good question about exporting happiness. But the first question that you had about how it all started with the UAE. I think it's really helpful when you have a prime minister that says we need to be focusing on happiness. Hearing something.
Well, I think we'll come back. I think we can just remove it.
That's okay. I'm good. So I think that's the easiest way for any country to start a happiness program is when your prime minister tells you we're going to start one. But that's how basically we got introduced to it at the UAE. Funny enough, I think it was 2 years prior before they announced the actual Ministry of Happiness. We found out about it in all places in Wisconsin, United States. I don't know if you're familiar with this place, but it's probably the most random place to be meeting with the future ministers of happiness, because there's not much in Wisconsin except for cheese and cows. But that's when we first realized that they were going to prioritize happiness. And a couple years later, that's when they announced the ministry. So what's great about that is that I think this could be an example for other countries. I mean, Bhutan is an obvious example by having started decades ago. But I think the reality of something like this happening has to come from the sincerity and authenticity of the leadership itself. So instead of, a lot of people are talking about happiness now, but what does it really mean? And if it truly is coming authentically from whether it's a king or the prime minister or the CEO of a company, that's when true, authentic happiness change can happen. And I think that's what we're seeing now in more and more countries, for example, like New Zealand. But in order for it to actually work, though, I think this whole thing of can you export happiness from one country to another, I think that's as easy as exporting happiness from one company to another or one person to another. I don't think exporting it can be more contagious. I don't think there's anyone in this world that looks at another person or another company that looks at another company that's successful and happy and will say, no, I don't want to be that way. I think most everyone will look at someone that actually is living a meaningfully happy life and say, what is that person doing? Or what is that company doing? Or what is that country doing? And what can I do to be like that as well? And why I don't think it's a product of exporting happiness is because happiness is so unique and happiness is so subjective, as we all know. But we also know there are objective measures that we can measure what happiness can be. So I think the idea of exporting is the opposite of what we need to do as citizens, as people that work in companies, is that we need to own it for ourselves. And essentially we need to define it for ourselves and what that true happiness means. And then it emanates. And this is what we're seeing in the UAE. Basically, they adopted the model that delivering happiness is created in terms of start with the me in the middle, then you go to the we, and then you go to the community, your fellow citizens, and then you go to the region, and then ultimately the world. And I love the fact that they recognize that happiness does start with yourself, and it is a choice. So whether it's a country or a company, it really starts there. So if we think about those kind of things, and if you really want to have successful implementation, as an example with Bhutan, as an example with UAE, I really think if you have that leader that sincerely believes in that happiness authentically for himself, for the people around them, if you have empowerment of leaders that want to carry on that message and actually implement it, if you have accountability for people that actually wants to put this in place, and in the end, if you have measurement to be able to show the progress, people always have this challenge in their mind of how can you actually measure happiness. I think the simplest way to think about it is this: just take a snapshot, draw a line in the sand, take another snapshot another day, next year, whatever. Are you above the line? Are you below the line? And then you can tell whether or not you're happier, or your company's happier, or your country's happier. So it's been a really fascinating experience working with the UAE and now with other companies and seeing how it actually can work. But again, it has to start with you.
Большое спасибо. Мы в России...
Thank you very much. We were joking before this session that we never really discussed happiness in Russia, so this subject isn't yet popular. And speaking about the global level, when I think about it, happiness as something that can be measured, can be developed, it all started very recently. But in Bhutan, they started it many years ago. 40 years ago, the king of Bhutan declared that it's much more important to achieve happiness for people rather than just calculate the percentage of GDP. So they developed the concept of gross domestic happiness. So many organizations got involved into achieving better results, and we are having the so-called Minister of Happiness of Bhutan, but in fact he is the director of a research center that deals with studying gross domestic happiness from Bhutan. Dorji Penjo. Could you tell us how it all happened? Could you describe the situation that you had in the last 40 years? How did you manage to achieve general happiness for your citizens? What kind of state measures could be taken in order to make everybody happy?
Okay. Thank you very much. Before I begin talking about happiness, I want to inform that I was here in Russia 2017 when I gave a presentation on happiness to the open comment of the Russian Federation, then to Moscow City Duma, Moscow University, and a roundtable at the Tomsk State University. So happiness is not new to Russia, and thank you, Russia, for embracing happiness. Just like in Russia, Bhutan follow a 5-year development plan. And at the moment we are into 12 5-year plan, and in 12 5-year plan we have 17 key indicators, 17 key result areas that has to be improved by the different government agencies, and these 17 is linked to the 9 domains of GNH, which we think is important for people to pursue happiness. First being the health, education, living standard, ecology, good governance, community, ecology, psychological well-being, and the way how we use time. And 17 development indicators are linked to 9 domains of GNH. And every agency in the government is supposed to improve the indicators of GNH in the process of improving or fulfilling these 17 targets. And if you can see, the development goals in Bhutan is highly influenced by GNH vision, the constitution, the king's speeches, and the past development plans. So this is the development framework of Bhutan as we follow at the moment. This is the 4th king of Bhutan who said that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. So he said it's more important. He didn't say GDP is not important. he said happiness is more important than money. And happiness is not new to Bhutan. If you look at our history, the person who founded Bhutan as the first nation state in mid-17th century said that government has no legitimacy if it cannot bring happiness to the people. So now the constitution of the Kingdom of Bhutan says that the government shall strive to promote those conditions that will make people pursue happiness. So what are the conditions? Back to these 9 domains of JNH. We believe that these are the 9 domains of JNH that must be created by the government or the state so that people could pursue their individual happiness. And in health, we have 4 domains of JNH, 4 indicators from self-reported health to disability, number of healthy days people enjoy, and the general mental health questions, 12 mental health indicators. Education, we look at people's general knowledge about certain specific issues, education level, literacy, and then some of the values which are fundamental to the functioning of any society. Then living standard is a proxy for GDP. So we look at people's asset in terms of land, livestock, and household goods. Then we look at at household, we look at the quality of toilet, access to electricity, kind of roof people use, and then the number of rooms they have, and then the household income. In ecology, we measure pollutions and waste, the urban common issues, the crop people lose to wildlife, and then people's attitude toward conserving national environment. And good governance, we look at the people's participation in politics. Do they vote, for example? And then we measure government's performance in creating jobs, reducing the gap between rich and poor, fighting corruption, providing health and education services, protecting environment, and then preserving culture and tradition. And then is the state or the government respecting fundamental rights promised by the Constitution? So we measure this, and the delivery of key services. In culture, we look at we in Bhutan is a small country, but we speak about 19 languages. So is the state or the government respecting people's right to speaking their own mother tongue? Then we measure arts and craft skill, people's participation in different culture activities, and the ways of Buddhist harmony, such as wearing this go. This is not a traditional go. This is our go, our dress. And if you don't wear this, we go naked. This is fundamental to our Buddhist identity, so way of harmony. In community vitality, we look at, are people donating time? Are people volunteering, giving donations to the needy? We look at the relationship at the family level and a relationship at the community level. And then what about the safety of the community? And then the psychological well-being, we measure life satisfaction. Spirituality, for us, spirituality matters if we are to pursue individual happiness. And then we measure 5 negative emotions and 5 positive emotions to actually see the true health of the community. And in time use, we look at for how many hours do people work and for how many hours people sleep. And then, of course, we also measure how many hours people devote to non-work, such as playing games, sports, helping your kids, helping our sick and the parents. So we now have a single JNH index. It's composed of 33 indicators, and which is composed of 123 variables, and those were the indicators taken from 9 domains of JNH I presented above. And these are the score of people of Bhutan on 33 indicators. So in values, for example, we have the high score in values and the poorest score in knowledge. So this is the score, national score. Happiness map of the country. So we know which district is lagging behind and which district is far ahead in terms of enjoying happiness. Darker the shade, happier the people, and lighter the shade, unhappier people. And men are happier than women. These are some of the brief report. Men are happier than women. Happiness general JNH index decreases with age. happiness is linked to education. Then we measure positive emotions and negative emotion by occupation. So monks have the lowest low emotion, and the armed forces have the highest negative emotions. So then this is a kind of correlation we do. So anger is related to enmity. So if you want to reduce enmity in the neighborhood, you bring the anger of the population. And then crime is also related to anger. Then these is the statistics for data for how many hours people sleep, work, and the number of hours devoted to non-works such as sports. And then these are the kinds of activities which are not factored by GDP, but in GNH we value these activities which are mostly done by women. So in GNH we factor this. Okay, so GNH World Happiness Report, for example, is based on asking one question. People were asked to rate their happiness from 0 to 10. You said how happy you are from 0 to 10. And then people just score, and that becomes the basis for measuring happiness in Western countries, for example. But what we say is that GNH is much more complex, holistic than the subjective happiness, which has dominated happiness research for so long. So if subjective well-being happiness is a tree, then GNH is a forest, if I could make this comparison. So this is how GNH as a alternative development model is linked to the mainstream development model in Bhutan. So, and we have developed policy screening tools to filter any policy coming out from different government agency, whether it's a policy or project or program, to check if it is promoting GNH indicators I have described above. So to cut the matter short, this is a 10-minute version of the GNH what we are doing, and the detailed presentation on GNH takes about 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker, Evgeny Gadmakhin, the member of the Coordination Council, expert group of European Dialogue, and also the representative of All Russian Forum, economist. I think he will clarify this, whether we really can measure happiness and whether we can think that happiness is an economic notion for us, also whether it's possible in Russia to figure out some criteria of happiness which could become a collective happiness for our country, and how can we measure happiness, how can we calculate happiness, and also forecast for the future. Well, so thank you very much that we have such a very interesting discussion. I will state several paradoxical thoughts. First of all, I think that happiness cannot be measured because all indicators which are being developed in the world, this is very subjective. Let's start with a very simple fact. For example, if some particular person, I know sociology, so we ask a person, are you happy? A person, even if he's not unhappy, he will say, I am happy. Why? Because it's quite, if you say that I'm unhappy, so it seems that you admit in your disaster, in your personal disaster, and this is very psychological. And that is why it's better maybe to tackle unhappiness, because there are lots of group of people, especially in such communities of European type, which are, clearly unhappy. For example, let's look at Russia. We have kids, and you know that poverty has a kid's face. It means that families in which we have kids where income is lower than the income minimum, these are not happy families. This is the zone, the area with which we should work, and these people should not be so unhappy. Then let's look at disabled person. The majority of disabled persons, of people, they are not happy. And there are many different reasons. The elderly people, old people, very often they are very lonely and they have low incomes and so on and so forth. So I think that so there is such a notion, and in Russia we don't mention this very often, and this is inclusion or exclusion or inclusion. So in communities, many groups of people, if they are included in social networks and they have an opportunity to help themselves, to help their community, this society will be much more, which will be much happier than community which does not have it. If we speak about Russia and some other countries where there are many groups of people which are quite isolated from this community cannot be happy. Or let's look at Southern African Republic apartheid period. I was in the Southern African Republic. In the village there are white people, everything is good, for example. They have flats, apartments, and African people. And you understand how they live. Whether it's possible for these people who live in white villages feel happy when they have so many problems. I think it's not possible. That is why this is like the first very important moment. Let's tackle unhappiness. Then GDP. Of course, I agree with the king of Bhutan that GDP is not so important. But we know the report presentation of Sarkozy, French President Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner. So they also wrote about this topic. And our colleague from Bhutan said that, yes, of course, we have to still provide for some certain level of GDP in the country. And secondly, GDP should be distributed evenly through all people. For example, in Russia, GDP per person is the same as in many European Eastern countries. But the amount of unhappiness is much more in Russia than there, because our distribution is not even. In Russia, we have inequality in Russia. There is no access to some social networks, to management. And again, let's take this example of Bhutan again, because this anti-elite moods in Europe accumulates also a big amount of unhappiness. We can see Brexit, and I've just come from London and I've discussed all this, and this Brexit also creates a lot of unhappiness, but the level of GDP in these countries is very high. Of course, there should be some financial standards, so what our colleague has mentioned. But in Russia, 2/3 of our families survive. They, are not able to put ends meet, and they have so many loans now. Our people. So, for example, I speak as an economist. We have a big problem here because sometimes people cannot pay loans. They take, one loan to cover another loan. This is like microloan situation. And what happens can it be if people live like this? If families live like this, they just only dream to get pension, for example, to live to pension, and maybe to get salary at once in the end of the month. And this is 2/3 of our families in Russia. And of course, this is not only in Russia, but as I see it, the amount of unhappiness, unsatisfaction is accelerating, and we see these high levels of GDP, but still in the world, it's accelerating. And I have this feeling And I think soon we'll have some dramatic changes, global changes. A lot will change in politics. For example, now we speak about direct democracy, about decentralization of government, and also we speak about economy. Now we speak about basic income in communities. I don't know. I think in Bhutan you also use it. So when people, all members of society, are guaranteed a certain amount of income, and they already are not, isolated, and they can do something else. So one person can be happy in household. For example, in Scotland, also it's been discussed to introduce this basic income, and there was the poll, and one woman says, I want this basic income because I will spend more time with my kids, not because I want to do something else. I just want to spend more time with my kids. That's why I think this is the global problem, how we can avoid unhappiness. And happiness, it can be very variable, and I don't want to impose different models on you. Of course, there are some objective things when a person is really ill. And of course, it's quite evident that he is very unhappy, and that's very relevant to Russia. We can see the situation now because our healthcare system also, has a lot of problems. Now, when we speak about this global strategy, so healthcare system is also very important. For example, kids, if they are ill, how can they study? How they can be our intellectual potential in the future if they're ill? For example. So now we need to build up these priorities, and we need to define these priorities, and also to give this opportunity to our society to go to the level when each person will think what he wants to be, what he wants to do. Because now the majority of people, not only in Russia, they are slaves of their opportunities, and that is the last thing, because the main goal of a successful, good society, this is self-expression, self-realization. And if we understand this with quite subtle methods, that a number of people who really want to do self-expression, and this number of people is increasing, yes, in this case we can say that we are on the way of some kind of happiness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evgeny, for this explosion. You really exploded. I guess the agenda has been exploded now, and now each speaker will have to respond to your statements, or maybe attack even you. And I suggest that Vladimir Filipov does it first, because he hasn't yet spoken. And what can you say to respond, Evgeny? So Vladimir is the representative of the Department of Labor and Social Protection. So he is a member of administration. He is a deputy director of the Department for Labor and Social Protection of Moscow. So since it's your professional responsibility to take care of social protection, what do you think about this dilemma that Evgeny described? He said that we don't have to fight for happiness, we have to fight against unhappiness. And these are completely opposite ideological vectors, so to say. They are completely different ideologies that the government authorities should tackle. So should we fight for happiness, or should we try to annihilate unhappiness? So which one is more promising, do you think? How we can transform this? Dear colleagues, can I ask you to raise hands if you came from different regions, if you are not from Moscow? Please raise your hands. Okay, good, thank you. be careful. We are going to have the, so to say, the interaction with the president. It's called direct line with the president in an hour or about so. In fact, I agree to a certain extent with Evgeny. We used to be Marxists, and we think that economy lays the foundation for everything. So this approach could be a factor of dehumanization for our society, because our society is not very humane. I'm not wearing a tie today. I'm an official person, but I would like to respond as a sociologist to a sociologist. So, speaking about happiness, especially if it's an official representative of the state that speaks about happiness, it might look comical. And it was probably the same in the 15th century when somebody dared say about the Ministry of Aviation and Aircraft, how can you talk about it? It's not on the agenda. We should take care of our crops. We should take all the precautions to avoid plague. But the society is developing continuously, so we have to increase and broaden the scope of our research. Of course, we focus on economy to a great extent. But when we speak about metropolitan cities and megapolises that compete for people, we are now saying that it's important that people felt comfortable in the city. They had to have successful careers. They have to feel comfortable in the city. So it's a must. And that's why we try to introduce the subject of happiness gradually. And it becomes as important as social protection or as education and healthcare or agricultural products. So it's a part of services. Maybe the word happiness has different semantic meaning, because whenever we congratulate each other, we usually wish health, well-being, and happiness. So it might be a tricky word, because you can't necessarily explain what it means. And in the recent years, we try to make our own contribution in happiness. We try to make it easier for people to interact with the authorities. There are special centers of public services that have been established. We select the personnel and staff members that work at our multifunctional centers of public services. You probably remember how it was in the past when people had to queue to get their passports issued. Now you can do it all online, and we have 125 centers, so the communication style is now different. They have the standard that they have to follow, and that's a new rhetoric that has been introduced by the mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin. And you can see the stand of Moscow longevity. We have a lot of retired people who are older than 50 years old, and there are different programs developed for them. Then by the 2030, we'll have over 4 million of retired people. People will start to live longer. For example, several decades ago, the average lifespan was 70 years old, but now it's much longer. So the healthcare has become more accessible. People can do different things during their spare time, so they don't feel neglected. So this new mayor's project appeared very recently, when we provide for older generation education, different activities, so they can get to know new people, they can get new emotions, irrespective of their level of income. Do you think it doesn't affect happiness? Of course it does, and we try to measure that, and we can see that the people got much more happy, and 13 couples got married among elderly people. So we do wish them happiness and health. So Yevgeny was right when he said that healthcare should be a priority, because it's important to be healthy. But I don't agree that all the people that are sick are unhappy. It's a challenge for us. So, like I said, I feel that there's a very high level of dehumanization, because nowadays we go more often for the technical maintenance of the car. It's more important than to get a medical examination. So it's just because we don't have enough time. You realize that you don't have a day to spend on this medical examination, and not every doctor will be happy to see you. Whereas if you get for the car maintenance, everybody is smiling because you're paying money, so they'll tell you what you should do with the car, etc. You can also go to one of the pavilions here, and we set up those temporary pavilions in over 40 districts of Moscow. So irrespective of registration, irrespective of the place of residence, any person can go to any such pavilion and get a medical examination, including heart diagram and all the other tests. So he can take all the tests and get the recommendations from the doctors. This such regular medical examination will make people live longer. So this is part of communication between a person and the city, and it will give the meaning to their lives. Now I can say that schools became more humane. We can criticize our exam system. There are lots of things to do yet, but anyway, it's not only about increasing the funding. Yesterday we were talking about this subject, the plenary session. We could improve our work with the same amount of funding, so that all the people that go to hospitals and polyclinics could feel authentic interest and genuine desire to help, because it's very important to get sincere services. Sorry to repeat this again and again. So it's true, we don't promote the concept of happiness, but we're just trying to improve our services, because it will make and give us some competitive advantages, and I hope that it will help to commercial organizations, governmental authorities, and make them think what they could improve at their workplace, so that the person could become more happy and more satisfied after he or she leaves their place. Thank you very much. So, Mike, what do you think now? What can you say? Would you like to respond to Yevgeny? So, first of all, he challenged the major thesis that is the foundation of your report. He says that we shouldn't trust people when they say they're happy. He said that sociology can be misleading. He said that when a person says he is happy, it's not necessarily true, and many people cannot be considered happy. if the economic conditions of their life do not comply with certain standards. So what can you say?
So I agree with Yevgeny in terms of we should focus on happiness just as much as on happiness. To me, that's the same or two different sides of the same coin. I actually also like to say sometimes I don't think necessarily these Scandinavian Nordic countries are the happiest in the world. I think they're the least unhappy countries in the world because I think those countries are really good at reducing causes for unhappiness. Can we trust happiness measures? I think we can. Are they perfect? No. Do they provide valuable information about what is important to people's lives? Yes. I don't think we should be scared of subjective measures. We study a lot of things that are subjective. We study loneliness, we study depression, we study stress. All of those things, as with happiness, is about how we as individuals experience our lives. I don't see why it should be more difficult to study a positive emotion compared to a negative emotion. Do people lie? Yes. But we can also see that when we follow people over time, and this has been done in the UK, this has been done in Germany, this has been done in a lot of countries, when we follow people over time and we ask them each year or each month or each day how happy they are, what we would expect impact their happiness, we see that in the data. So imagine if we were following you for the next year. So could you please raise your hand if you think you would be less happy if you suddenly lost your job? All the way up, please. Okay, down again. So could you please raise your hand if you think you would be less happy if you or your family got a serious illness? That's what we see in the data. If people lose their job, they become less happy. If people become sick, they become less happy. They might lie that they're happier than they really are, but we see the changes we would expect. When those people got married, we talked about before, we also see an increase in happiness levels. Another thing, how many of you would be happier if we reduced the traffic congestion in Moscow? So this is what we should use. So what we're saying is we should look at happiness data. We should understand what drives unhappiness and happiness for people, and we should apply that to our decisions. So when we know what we know from happiness research, how should our cities look differently? How should our policies look differently? How should our workplaces look differently? That's what we're trying to do. And I think that is also what is working in the Nordic countries, putting that at the core of what we're trying to do. So just to give you an example in terms of how we can design cities differently and how policies and urban design impact how we feel and how we act. So in Copenhagen, the majority where I live, the majority of people, they cycle to work. They cycle to university, they cycle to work. The members of parliament, they cycle to parliament, the majority of them. They don't do that because it's good for the environment or because it's healthy. They do that because there have been investment in infrastructure for cyclists and for the pedestrians. And there is a priority, for instance, when there is a winter, and if there's snow, there's a priority to clear the bicycle lanes before you clear the car lanes. There are bridges over the harbor in Copenhagen only for cyclists and for pedestrians. And that means you have an infrastructure that makes cycling the logical choice. Another example to contrast that was I was in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, a couple of years ago, and I was staying in a hotel quite close to the botanical garden. And I thought, okay, there's a couple of 100 meters, I'll try and go over to the botanical garden. And I gave up halfway because there was no pavement, there was no way to access the botanical garden in a safe way as a pedestrian. And now Kuala Lumpur has invested billions of dollars in infrastructure, but forgotten people and cyclists. So they've invested for cars. And that means you are essentially telling people, if you do not own a car, you are a second-rate citizen. And I like Copenhagen that a pedestrian, a cyclist can be treated as kings and queens of the road. And what we can see in the happiness data is people, some of the worst times of the day is driving to and from work. It's being stuck in traffic. And so it's just to say, don't be scared of subjective measures. There's actually only one person here who can tell us whether Jen is happy or not, and that is Jen. And that is what we're trying to add some value to and put at the core of what we're trying to achieve. So don't be scared.
Спасибо. Опять-таки я сейчас предложу Джен подискутировать.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask Jenny to respond. So Evgeny said that we should think how we can reduce the level of unhappiness. That was one of his points. Then he also mentioned some political changes. So without political changes, the personal happiness cannot be achieved sometimes. So you have a massive experience when you worked in United Arab Emirates and some other countries where you worked. So, do you agree with Evgeny's statement? Do you believe people when they say they're happy? And do you think that personal happiness is possible without any political changes?
Well, first off, I have to say this is probably the first ever happiness panel I've ever been on with a recommendation to focus on unhappiness. So I think that's interesting, and I'm going to respectfully disagree, but I'm not going to say you're wrong, because I think it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game when we're looking at this. I think we're at a positive-sum game world. We've evolved from the times in the past where we had to worry about everyday psychological, physiological needs in a different way. If we think about Maslow's hierarchy, we've evolved from that time overall, and we have the data that shows that we as a global society, and I'm not going to just focus on the UAE, I'm not just going to focus on any country, because I believe we should be looking at this in a global perspective, and we have the data that shows that we as a humankind evolved in a place, in a way that we're more secure, we have more peace, we have more tools and abilities to survive, if not thrive. So this is not me just trying to be happy. This is me saying, let's look at the other data, the actual objective data that we're making decisions on and basing decisions on. So I would like to suggest, instead of looking at just, and this is really I'm echoing what you're saying in a slightly different manner, but basically, why not look at both? Look at happiness and unhappiness at the same time, because that's the reality of what this life is. And I believe understanding our own personal happiness, to your question, who knows if you're happy? You do. And being able to define that is your basically responsibility and right. And understanding that true authentic happiness is understanding not only your highs, but really understanding your lows. So yes, of course, let's talk about unhappiness. And yes, of course, let's talk about death. And yesterday's panel was a great presentation on the hospice and palliative care and how that's being changed and evolved and improved here in Moscow, in Russia. And it's amazing to think that something as unhappy as becoming dismembered or becoming disabled or just, like the sheer idea of death, how people are actually looking at those moments in life and looking on the other side of it. How can we make that happier? How can we make that more respectful? How can we make that moment in our lives that we all encounter, whether it's death or whether it's losing a job or whether it's sitting in traffic? How can we actually embrace these things that, hey, this is going to be a part of it, so what can I do to actually make the most of it? And I just feel as a society, because in general things have been improving in these amazing ways, it's just a disservice to all our other ancestors, our relatives, our generations prior to us that really fought so hard just to get to this place where no matter where we are in society, socioeconomically, politically, etc., those things will all ring true. That is just the statement of the reality of the world today. So why not accept it and understand there are ways that we can personally, subjectively, own our own happiness to change. I believe more than ever, it's not about this binary, I'm happy, unhappy. We're all experiencing these things at the same time, but the most important thing now, I believe, is adapting. And this idea of being able to control and own what we can, like your own happiness, and embrace and adapt to things that we can't control, like death, like losing your job, like losing your sight, whatever it might be. So I guess I just respectfully disagree. But again, I don't think you're wrong, but I think we all can collectively be right.
Thank you very much, Dorji. So I will continue to discuss Evgeny's speech, who is doubtful about this, that we can think that people are happy, those people who consider themselves happy, because if they live in poverty, if their level of life seems to be not high. So Evgeny in this case says that these people are quite unhappy and their happiness is quite doubtful, not 100%. The question is to you: do you trust your citizens when they say they're happy? Are you doubtful that the system of happiness measurements is not perfect? Maybe many people criticize the system which exists in Bhutan, and I've read about this. I've read several critical articles, and they spoke about your model, whether it's perfect or not, and they attract attention to this criteria as education, for example, or learning mother tongue language, and maybe I did not pay attention, but I did not see such a criteria as learning foreign culture, foreign languages. Maybe the important factor of happiness for your citizens maybe is a lack of global culture, of global context, that there are some other models, other economic conditions, and when they learn about these other conditions, they can feel less happy.
I can understand why Evgeny.
Your mic is probably not working.
Hello.
Yeah, just press the button.
Hello.
Or
Yeah, I can actually understand why Evgeny has doubt over measuring happiness. Everywhere I go, one or two people always ask us, how do you measure happiness? Well, GNH is a critique of GDP, number one. GNH is also a critique of measuring happiness. The kind of happiness measurement that has been going on for a long time in this, especially in Western Europe, in North America. As I said, people were asked to rate their happiness from 0 to 10. And that is the foundation of measuring happiness thus far. In GNH, we also ask this question. We ask people, are you happy? How would you rate your happiness from 0 to 10? And we don't even consider that response important. What we measure is the conditions, that indicators which we think are important for one's well-being, one's happiness. In our methodology, there are about 60% of the indicators are subjective, and 40% are objective. And when we do the calculation, we give more weight to objective indicators and less to subjective indicators. So I think why did we measure happiness? Why did we measure happiness? Is anything that we place, we measure and assign number is given importance. Anything that is unmeasurable, immeasurable, is not constant important. So the need to measure happiness is to bring it to the national agenda, to say that you have measured this and we are measuring happiness, so why not we give importance to those indicators which are very important. GDP, for example, I think it measures money, but GDP, I think, is an inadequate measure of countries' wealth, for example. So when we cannot measure GDP adequately, there's no question about measuring happiness. But the fact is that when we didn't measure happiness, we were 100% wrong. But now we have measured happiness, we could say we are 50% right. So so GNH as a critique of happiness study or measuring happiness, I think is a kind of a new thinking which Bhutan, for example, has kind of critiqued the mainstream happiness measurement. So that's one point. And second is when we measure happiness, for every indicators we have a so-called threshold or a pass mark. So moment you pass the threshold, we don't consider those people who have passed or considered to be happy as we ignore them. Our attention is on those people who could not meet the pass mark on each and every indicators. So and then the kind of methodology we have designed is such that it's very easy for us to go to know in which village there are maximum disabled people, or in which county there are uneducated or people who are not going to school. So our methodology makes it possible for the government to do right kind of intervention, whether it's a social, whether it's education, health, or the other social services. I think I really agree that the focus should be on those people who are not happy, and actually forget those people who are happy. So as I said, we have a pass mark. For example, for healthy days is one indicator. So for a person to be happy, considered happy, he or she has to be active physically for 26 days out of 30. So if he or she is not is handicapped for 6 days, those people are considered unhappy, and we pay all the attention on those people who have not met the threshold. So that would be my answer to your question, your doubt on measuring happiness, and on focusing on those people who are not yet happy. Well, those people who are happy also count, but then the government's priority should be on those people who are not happy. And for the first time, we have an entire map of, for example, the negative and positive map of the country we have. So, for example, the youth in Bhutan, people from the age of 16 to 18 are going through the highest level of anger. And now, for the first time, we know that youth are angry. So why are youth angry? We are asking this fundamental question and trying to make them cool, solve their anger, negative emotion, solve problem through right curriculum, by revising or teaching pedagogy, by introducing meditation or contemplation exercise or lessons in the classroom. So whatever we measure, we don't ask people, are you happy or are you sad? No, we are measuring those indicators, whether it's social, educational, environmental, developmental, government, which we think are very important for a person to enjoy full happiness, and trying to improve those indicators in which people are lagging behind, and then create a very equal enabling environment for everybody to pursue their own individual happiness. State provides condition for people to be happy, to pursue happiness, whereas it is up to the individual whether to make best use of, for example, free health. Education is free in Bhutan, health is free, 72.5% of the national environment is under forest cover, and then we, as this morning I was explaining to my colleague that we don't allow backpackers to come to Bhutan. We are very mindful about losing our culture, we are mindful about losing our environment. So GNH, in our case, a small country, is serving Bhutan perfectly well. And GNH is not really for export. GNH is for the people of Bhutan, for us to manage development, not for export in a conference like this, because it's for us. But given the tremendous interest GNH has generated across the world, we are forced to say something about what we are doing back at home. And we do not claim to be the happiest people or the happiest country or very happy, but what we try to do is that we aspire happiness and we work towards that, and whatever resources we have, we use it very productively to create conditions for the people to pursue happiness. Thank you.
Большое спасибо. Я бы хотел
Thank you very much. I would like also to ask Vladimir about his opinion. Maybe in Moscow government there is also a map of Moscow happiness, which is very similar to the map from our guest from Bhutan. I would like to look at this dark green or light green zones in Moscow, and I would like to see where Muscovites are happy and where they are not so happy. Also, I would like to ask you what models and lessons from what we have heard in the course of our discussion, and I'm sure you also know this topic, and what will you use from this? Can you really use this Dorje model and the research, how many hours people sleep, how many hours they have, for how many hours they have free time? Can we use it in our country? Should we really study happiness of people in such details? Should we change our government policy? And do we need to use foreign experience? How do you think? First of all, in the first part of my presentation, I focused on this, and I will repeat some part for my presentation. This topic of happiness in the governmental programs, in regulations, we don't use this topic usually, but we are very governmental country, because for each movement we have regulations, protocols. It would seem that we should have a very safe place, the safest place in the world. We have instructions for everything, starting from labor lessons for kids, ending up with anything, what to do when there is fire, and there are always plans, evacuation plans when you have fire, and for people who have weak eyesight, we have plans. So it seems we are very safe. But now we have this happiness topic at this forum, and we add this happiness topic as also a priority for us. For us, it's some kind of experiment, but also we start to believe in this, that happiness is important. Mrs. Chernigovskaya and also Mr. Kurpatov, who is learning neuro studies, and these colleagues, they say that there are some other practices, and these practices say that happiness is something what your brain expresses. And the brain, this is like a muscle. So you can set up your brain yourself because brain is lazy and it tries to have a pattern, and we, I think everybody, of course, here read Dostoevsky, right? Fyodor Dostoevsky, and maybe we are not so religious, but still we have an Orthodox religion, and the Orthodox religion says to us that we have to suffer in our lives, and happiness will be in paradise. But now in our lives we should suffer a little bit, and we understand that what we now can do in 2019, in the 21st century in Moscow, having political will, having disciplined vertical, which got used to work in accordance with the standards, and this topic about respect to people, and we don't have, of course, this map of Moscow happiness, but we have a lot of maps regarding traffic jams, and if there are less traffic jams, maybe we will be happy even because of this. If the job is lost, maybe people will not be unhappy automatically because of this. Or maybe someone is married, it seems happiness, maybe not always people are happy when they are married, because happiness is quite subjective and vague, and thanks God, it should not be a subject of the government regulation. But again, I can repeat myself that our country is very quite strongly regulated. And our forum of these innovations is about our social sphere. Maybe we should also decentralize some functions and send them to business or non-commercial organizations. And maybe in this case, people will be happy. So to answer directly to your question, yes, of course, we believe in this. We study all foreign experience and all practices, best cases, because sometimes we are blamed, officials are blamed that we are only thinking about ourselves, but maybe to some degree this is right. But we should live in this city, and we want it to be comfortable and help us to be happy, and this is very important for us. Thank you very much. And what can you respond to your opponents? So they blamed you in non-constructive approach, that you focus on unhappiness and you risk to be face to face with unhappiness, and maybe in this case you will forget your journey to happiness. I'm deeply happy that we have this discussion, first of all. Secondly, Vladimir started already this topic, and the government as an institute in any country, not only in Russia, has also some way to exaggerate the situation. But if in the center of the government policy, sorry about the colleague from Bhutan, but if the center of the government, policy will have so the instruction to increase the amount of happiness by some year, in this case it would be a disaster in our country, because we all understand, and I'm also an official, quite experienced, I worked a lot in different places, and we all understand that all these mechanisms are quite well known. When I speak, why do I speak about unhappiness? Because unhappiness, that community, the society agrees about this. A loss of job, for example, this is quite subjective, of course. But our colleague, for example, says, I lost work and I'm unhappy. But now, for example, at our labor market, youngsters prefer to be freelancers. And, for example, my son is also a freelancer. I say to him, so do you like it? And he says, yes, I like communicate, maybe I would get less money, but I will do what I like. I can leave my job, and then I just maybe for 1 year I want to just be in nature, to meditate, reflect, and to think my own thoughts. Let's not regulate this process, what happiness is. Let's give an opportunity to people to understand whether they are happy or not. And for this, we need to solve some basic things which I'm speaking about. Now let's speak about this world progress. Yes, we need progress, but look, in the countries, very civilized countries with very high GDP, people worry about environment. For example, green people, so to say, green groups, they get more votes in Europarlament. Environment is changing, and I feel unhappy again. Even in civilized countries, Hong Kong, for example, 1 million people is against the law regarding extradition. So Hong Kong, I was in Hong Kong. It's a very developed place, and economically, and also 1 million people, were against this. Now, in Russia, we increased the pension, the age when people go to pension, when they get retired, and people became very unhappy when it was declared that now the situation regarding pension changed. The age of pensioners will change; it will be higher, and so the government maybe needs to build up their policy like this to minimize this, this conflicts.
So yes, of course, we can imbue people with more positive emotions. And statistically speaking, we have a very high share of domestic violence here in Russia. And this is very important. It means that something is wrong, something doesn't work well. And maybe we have a lot of, there are questions that we should address to our police. Many people complain that our courts do not give fair decisions. And sometimes people are surprised with the decisions and that are made by courts. Of course, I'm not against happiness, but let's be realists. Let's not just chat about such an important issue. Maybe the question of happiness is on the top of the agenda, and still, we have to be very careful about it. We have to prepare ourselves just to make sure we don't chat only, because all the words, humanization, human dignity, should be supported by specific actions, by real deeds. I'm not actually a Marxist. I studied Marx and Engels. I know their works, but I'm not a Marxist. I think that the most important thing is a human being. So it should all evolve around a human being. So the principal question of today is the question of the relationship between a person and the state. If the person is a slave of the state, the people will never be happy in such a state. But, for example, if the person has the freedom of choice, if he or she has free will within the legislation, then, of course, we can say that we will be able to create a humane society with positive emotions prevailing over negative emotions. But let's not build air castles, because we have had such experience in Russia. We started reforms in the early 90s, because in the past we thought we would have democracy and market, but we see only the massive disappointment. And who is to blame? It's not people who is to blame. It's the authorities that started this process without any preparation. So that was the point that I was trying to make. So somebody mentioned Dostoevsky, and this discussion reminded me about Tolstoy quotation: all happy families are similar, whereas all unhappy families have their own problems. So we are running out of time, about 5 minutes, so each speaker has just 1 minute. And I would like to shift from the global level to personal level, because it's true that your own happiness, each person's happiness is more important, because without the individual you can't make the country happy. So just 1 minute for you to sum it up. What makes you happy personally? And what do you usually do to make the closed one happy? It might sound intimate, but it's true that it's very personal, and I'm aware of this, but just answer the way you find appropriate. So it's my question for all, because we will have to wrap it up very soon, because we're running out of time. So it's like a blitz or express question for all.
I'm happy that I can be on a panel where there's a differing in opinion and we can all be right and we can all walk away with this something learned. And that essentially to me comes back to my values of having freedom to be able to receive that experience. And my second biggest value are relationships. So for me, as long as I have those two things and prioritize for myself in my life, then I am a happy person. So that's my way to stay sustainably happy.
Thank you.
I think he was right that happy people are all the same. I think we're going to repeat some of the same things. I mean, to me also happiness is not a one ingredient dish. There's a lot of different things we want on our plate when we feel happy. Having an interesting job is part of that. Having quality, good relationship is another. So, I mean, I feel happy when I sit at home late at night writing my books. That gives me a sense of purpose, which is also important for happiness. Another thing, in 2 weeks I'm going on a vacation for 2 weeks. I'm going to swim. I'm going to eat wild cherries. I'm going to fish. That's going to bring me a lot of happiness. But I think it comes down to experiencing positive emotions on a daily basis, connecting with loved ones, having something interesting to do, having enough resources and the freedom to be able to do it. I think those are pretty good ingredients for happiness.
I think for me personally, for personal happiness, the source of my personal happiness is my family. I think family is fundamental to personal happiness. Individually, I get a lot of happiness.
Excuse me. Can you make it a bit closer to the microphone?
Okay, no. At the personal level, I get a lot of happiness when I read literature. Go to family level, family is the source of all happiness to me. And if I go much beyond that, at national level, to be a citizen of a small country, Bhutan, nestled in the Himalaya, who has a country that has a king who said gross national happiness is more important than gross domestic product, and to interact with people, the citizen in the street who talks about happiness as a value in their life, to be in the middle of this thing is the happiness I try to get. I get every day without fail. Thank you.
Well, since some people gave quotations, I can quote, I feel happy when I'm being understood. And speaking personally, I feel happy when I am alone, when I can reflect, when I don't have to rush. I think that, the most common feeling that people have is this light sadness. You don't have to broadcast it to others, but this is the feeling that prevails. And whenever you meet people that you can speak using the common language, it's great. Actually, nowadays it has become a big problem here in Russia because we don't have a common language nowadays. People got angrier. People got involved in some things that they can't understand what you say. They can't understand your argument. So those things that are values for me. I tried to get ready, but then I realized there are so many things I don't know what to say. I'll tell you the truth. Happiness is about honesty. And it makes me happy when I see the results of my work. And I can hear those that melody. So I have been working at the Department for Culture since 2012, and we did a lot of work to make changes in the parks. So it was again a large-scale project here in Moscow. Maybe I'm using again a Marxist approach, but it was great to see people that were interested in transformation. So it's great to see the results of your work. I can see this forum that is on a very high level, but I don't want to mix poetry and practice. Maybe I could give a lyrical response, but since I'm dealing with social policies, I have meetings with scientists, I read reports, I understand that happiness is about hormones because hypothalamus and many other brain parts generate these hormones. So yes, there are people that are angry. At a certain, maybe a woman gets angry because nobody hugged her for a long time, and we should understand it. Maybe it's about the shortage of dopamine. So we should remain poetry lovers. We should be romantic, and sometimes you can be happy after you have good food, after you hug somebody, after you had lovely holidays, and then you will feel happy. Thank you. So we quoted Tolstoy, and 5 happy people are happy in a different way. I hope that you have seen it, and I think our discussion has been very interesting, and I would like to thank all the participants, Mike Viking, Jenny Lin, Georgy Penjo, Vladimir Filipov, Evgeny Gantahir. Thank you for your participation in our discussion. And our moderator, of course, Mikhail Zygar. Thank you very much for this excellent session. Please make sure you return your headsets.
Вы его брали, даже если вы вернетесь в наш зал, даже если вы пойдете в другие залы, сдайте, пожалуйста, обязательно ваш синхронный перевод.